nam się przyśni i wszystkie słowa wypowiedziane. Albo jesteś naszym wrogiem, albo naszym kompanem.
Early in the year 2009, the Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk arrives here in Davos for the World Economic Forum. He is one of several guests who are welcomed in Vladimir Putin's apartment, who meets with several politicians. After the meeting, the Polish Prime Minister approaches journalists and informs them that he's optimistic.
Polski premier wychodzi do dziennikarzy i informuje ich, że jest optymistą.
The number one guest here was the Russian Prime Minister, and Donald Tusk spoke to him in the afternoon. We both expressed our willingness to resolve at least what can be resolved in bilateral Polish-Russian relations. The good atmosphere in Davos was supposed to help the Prime Minister resolve Poland's most urgent issue of gas. Speaking with the Russians about gas is not only a conversation with companies, but also a political one. The declaration of Prime Minister Putin was clear. The conversation between the Polish and the Russian Prime Ministers also concerned the issue of Russian missiles deployed near the Polish border in response to the plan to deploy missile shield elements in Poland. I have the impression after this conversation, perhaps even a bit more than an impression, that Russia is also not particularly interested in choosing such solutions. The Polish Prime Minister's optimism after he heard from Vladimir Putin that he was wondering whether not to give up targeting Iskander missiles at Poland is incredible, as in fact is the entire meeting with Donald Tusk referring to things that had already happened earlier. The threat concerning Iskander missiles was made for the first time a year earlier, when the Polish Prime Minister visited Moscow. At the time, Russia sent this kind of message, threatening Poland that if it signed the agreement and realised the agreement on the missile shield, there would be no agreement with Russia. In January 2000, this process is still being prolonged by Poland. There is a new US President, Barack Obama, but the case is not yet closed. The Russians know that Poland is interested in reconciling positions. They thus try to get even more concessions from Poland. During this meeting, such concessions are made. The Russians know that Poles are willing to do so, as in June of the previous year, Donald Tusk sent a letter to Vladimir Putin, in which he wrote, among others, about us purchasing even more crude oil and gas. This matter turned up during this meeting as well. During this meeting, Donald Tusk also said that he hoped that Vladimir Putin would resolve the problem of marine traffic on the Vistula Lagoon, which implicitly meant that Poland would not build a channel across the Vistula Spit. Finally, here in Davos, Poland's most significant proposal was made, inviting Vladimir Putin to visit Poland in 2009.
Jeszcze w roku 2009. 14 stycznia 2009
On January the 14th, 2009, the Russian Federation Embassy in Poland sent a letter to the Foreign Ministry, a letter in which they confirmed the visit would take place. It comprised the following standard message. The Embassy of the Russian Federation in the Republic of Poland agrees to the meeting of Mr. Vladimir Putin and Mr. Donald Tusk at the World Economic Forum in Davos, as the Russians wrote on January the 29th at 2 p.m.
29 stycznia o godzinie 14.
The meeting, in the opinion of the Foreign Ministry, yielded positive changes in bilateral relations. Moreover, as a result of this meeting, as we read in this document, Vladimir Putin confirmed his readiness to visit Poland in the second half of 2009.
Wizyty w Polsce w drugiej połowie roku 2009.
The first 3 months of 2009 show that a positive trend is increasingly visible in the Polish-Russian relations. This is evidenced by the meeting of the Prime Ministers of Poland and Russia in Davos on January the 29th, at which Vladimir Putin expressed his readiness to revisit Poland in 2009 in the form of an intergovernmental consultation. At the meeting in Davos with Putin on January the 29th, 2009, Tusk proposed or discussed Putin's revisit to Poland. Revisit because it was supposed to be a response to Tusk's visit of the February the 8th, 2008 to Moscow. Yet, in a moment, the Polish Foreign Ministry, primarily through Jarosław Pratkiewicz, director of the Eastern Department, shall decide that the visit, which would take place in the early autumn, or let us say end of the summer, that is on August the 31st and September the 1st, 2009 in 3 cities, should not be considered in terms of a revisit, but rather greater European policy. And within that frame, a certain sector of European policy supposedly had the voice of Prime Minister Tusk, actually proposing Russia's participation in the security architecture in matters of energy security. Poland has a role to play here because the term of previously concluded agreements, shall I say, are ending, concerning the transmission of gas and so on. And probably Tusk knows that in order to realise this European agenda, he has to get rid of the problem, of historical issues, bluntly speaking.
I pewny Tusk wie, że żeby tą agendę europejską realizować, musi rozmasować, brzydko mówiąc, kwestie natury historycznej.
Minister Lavrov's visit, which took place a month after the war in Georgia, confirmed that Poland is treated by Russia as a major EU and NATO country, the voice of which has a direct impact on shaping the Eastern EU and NATO policies. This point of view is described in Radosław Sikorski's information memo of March the 23rd, 2009 to Donald Tusk. This document was drafted by Jarosław Pratkiewicz. It speaks of a Polish initiative for the debate on the long-term perspective of EU's relations with the Russian Federation. The document speaks moreover of cooperation with countries comprising the eastern neighbourhood, non-confrontational with Russia. The document, signed by Sikorski, further states that the issue of Soviet aggression against Poland and reminding of the cooperation of Russia and Germany in 1939 constitute a potential eruption of historical clichés. This was a quote which may cause, quoting again, a polemic reaction of Putin himself, which in turn might affect the course of his September visit to Poland. On March the 24th, 2009, Donald Tusk wrote another letter to Vladimir Putin. In the letter, he requested political support for the candidate for an important international position. I fully share the recommendations of Jean-Claude Juncker's report, indicating that solely a personality with the highest competencies, highest integrity should lead this oldest political institution of our continent. It is about the Council of Europe. And the personality with such high values is the former collaborator of the Communist Security Services, codenamed Carex or Carex, Włodzimierz Cimoszewicz. In the letter, Donald Tusk also writes,
W liście Donald Tusk pisze również:
I would like to emphasize that 20 years after the major breakthrough which took place in Central and Eastern Europe, it is time to elect an important politician from this region to the position of the Council of Europe's Secretary General. Donald Tusk also writes, I am deeply convinced that the political experience of Mr. Cimoszewicz, his involvement in the Polish transformation over 2 decades, and his thorough knowledge of European relations makes him a candidate particularly predisposed to this position. I will thus be very grateful for your kind support for the appointment of Mr. Włodzimierz Cimoszewicz as the Council of Europe's Secretary General. Kind regards, Donald Tusk.
Droga od spotkania.
The road from the meeting of the Polish and Russian prime ministers in Davos to the meeting of these two politicians in Gdansk and Sopot in September 2009 was convoluted and led through Moscow. The team of Donald Tusk sought the favour of the Russian dictator not merely through humble letters requesting support from communist activists and agents of communist secret services. It also meant personal meetings, such as this meeting of Radosław Sikorski and Sergei Lavrov in Moscow. During this visit, Radosław Sikorski was to prepare Vladimir Putin's arrival in Poland a few months earlier. Sikorski wanted to meet Putin in person at the Kremlin. The meeting did not take place, however, despite the hopes of Radosław Sikorski. After all, just a few months earlier, Sergei Lavrov, head of the Russian Foreign Ministry, met the Polish Prime Minister while visiting Poland. Thus, Radosław Sikorski counted on reciprocity, since the relations between Poland and Russia were so good. The agenda of the visit speaks a lot about defining the goals of such a meeting with Vladimir Putin, which ultimately did not happen.
Które ostatecznie z Władimirem Putinem nie doszło do skutku.
Presenting an outline of the concept of intergovernmental consultations in the context of Vladimir Putin's planned visit to Poland and the agenda of the September 1st celebrations with the participation of the Russian Federation's Prime Minister. Explanations concerning Vladimir Putin's expectations regarding his visit to Poland. Delivering the opinion of Prime Minister Donald Tusk on existing possibilities of deepening bilateral economic cooperation, especially in the field of energy for Russian investments. Lukoil's terminal in Gdansk, obtaining a clear political signal indicating the readiness of the Russian Federation authorities to work out a settlement for the Katyn issue satisfactory for both parties. Clearly, however, Radosław Sikorski hoped that the meeting with Vladimir Putin would take place. This hope is associated with one of the most interesting and, to be honest, most compromising and humiliating incidents for Poland. Traces of this incident remain in the archives of the Foreign Ministry. Radosław Sikorski did arrive at the Kremlin. However, he was not admitted by a guard, even though a whole motorcade of Polish diplomats drove up there. Jerzy Bar, ambassador of the Republic of Poland to the Russian Federation, thus described the incident in a memo. Concerning not admitting the motorcade with Minister Sikorski to the Kremlin on the 6th of this month, Grinin once again apologized for the incident, both on his own behalf and the management of the ministry. It was already the fourth apology after the apology given by the Minister Titov, Director Nikhaev, and a representative of the protocol of the Russian Federation's Foreign Ministry, simultaneously exercising the order of Minister Sikorski. I relayed his opinion that after the apologies he considered the case of the incident in front of the Boroviskaya gate closed. Despite all these compromises and humiliations, Vladimir Putin's visit to Poland is still taking place. The Russian Federation's Prime Minister proposed historical symbolism concerning World War II since the start of his visit. And looking back, it is difficult not to perceive it as a further humiliation of Poland. It is not just about what his services published before the arrival of the Russian Prime Minister in Poland, but also the place where he stayed was full of symbolism. It was the Grand Hotel, which hosted another war criminal in 1939, 2 weeks after the outbreak of World War II, namely Adolf Hitler, who, according to this document, preserved in the German Federal Archives, stayed at this beautiful place at the time when his troops were shelling Poland, murdering Polish people, shooting the first victims of the German fight for a living space in the East. Adolf Hitler's visit to the Grand Hotel, which had a different name at the time, started 2 days after the Soviet attack on Poland, precisely on September the 19th, 1939, and, according to sources, lasted until September the 26th, 1939. At the time, the building and the hotel served as Adolf Hitler's headquarters.
W tym czasie ten budynek i ten hotel służył za główną kwaterę Adolfa Hitlera.
Before Vladimir Putin arrived in Poland, scenes and events took place in the Russian media and political space that we have not remembered since Poland regained independence. Russian intelligence generals held a conference and published a book. A book which suggested that the outbreak of World War II was the responsibility of Poland.
Odpowiadała Polska.
At exactly the same time as the prime ministers of Poland and Russia were strolling on the pier in Sopot, the Russian intelligence was to present alleged evidence of Poland cooperating with Hitler at a special conference. This publication is dedicated primarily to all children going to school holidays so that they can learn what the true history was. Russian television, Channel 1, in its prime time, broadcasted a film which accused the Polish government of sympathizing with Hitler. It is difficult to talk about a change for the better, though, if at the same time a book prepared by Russian intelligence was presented accusing Poland of cooperating with Hitler. Poland and Germany participated in the partition of Czechoslovakia and discussed actions against the Soviet Union. The Russian intelligence failed to provide any evidence to confirm this alleged cooperation between Poland and the Nazis. Mariusz Piekarski, RMF. Why has there been no reaction so far? We are a nation proud of our place in the history of Europe. We are a large country, significant in the European Union, and I am convinced that the government of a country like Poland should not engage itself in polemics with journalistic materials or comments, even if they are as silly and as unfair as those which have recently appeared in the public debate in Russia. I will also vigorously defend our fundamental foreign policy assumption based on the idea of good neighbourly relations, primarily with our neighbours. This brings good effects, even if, from time to time, our sensitivity is so painfully violated, as in the last days by some commentators, historians and journalists in Russia.
Naruszana jak w ostatnich dniach przez niektórych komentatorów, czy historyków, czy publicystów w Rosji.
The conference and the book were no accident, of course. Russian intelligence generals do nothing by accident. We learned that this was not a coincidence from a letter to the Poles, published, not surprisingly, by Gazeta Wyborcza Daily. The author of the letter was none other than Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. In his report from Moscow at the time, the Gazeta Wyborcza Daily journalists wrote that the letter was absolutely groundbreaking and fundamental because the Russian Federation and Vladimir Putin addressed the issue of formal problems between Poland and Russia. He also spoke about history. The letter is so rude that it's hard to imagine what its author was thinking while writing it, in an atmosphere of a reset and a supposedly improving relations between Poland and Russia. The main content is that Poland and Russia are on exactly the same level in terms of mutual responsibility, as supposedly evidenced by the same significance of the killing of 26,000 Polish officers in Katyn with a shot in the back of the head, with the fact that, after the Bolshevik aggression against Poland, Russian invaders died of typhoid in captivity in Poland.
Zginęli rosyjscy najeźdźcy.
The Russian people, whose fate has been distorted by the totalitarian regime, understand well the feelings of Poles associated with Katyn, where thousands of Polish soldiers rest. We should remember the victims of this crime together. Both the cemeteries of memory of Katyn and Mednoye and the tragic fate of the Russian soldiers who were imprisoned during the war of 1920 should become a symbol of mutual regret and mutual forgiveness. The text was aggressive, defending the most Stalinist historical interpretations, already disguised as a sort of historical Putinism. In my opinion, the most important issue of it, and I'm saying this very seriously, my voice is breaking when I come to think of it, that has not been cleared, rebuffed in any way by the Polish Prime Minister, the Polish governmental authorities, which led to it in general, but also by Gazeta Wyborcza Daily in any way. The issue is that Putin combined in one paragraph the matter of the Katyn crime, his genocide committed by the Bolsheviks in 1940 on Polish officers. With the fate of the Bolshevik prisoners of war invading Poland and Warsaw in 1920. That is one paragraph, two completely different events connected into a whole that looks unambiguous, namely, Katyn was a response for what you did first. It matters in history, or the history of politics, who was the first criminal, and thus this is how it is set.
W historii polityki ma znaczenie, kto pierwszy był zbrodniarzem. I to jest tak ustawione.
W tym liście
In this letter, Vladimir Putin proposes one more thing: establishing strategic cooperation between the Russian Federation and Poland, the same cooperation that Russia and Germany had for many years.
Łączy Rosję z Niemcami.
Today, the Russian-German cooperation plays a very important, positive role in international and European policy. I am certain that also the Russian-Polish relations will also sooner or later reach such a high, true partnership level. It lies in the interests of our nations and the whole continent of Europe. And that is exactly what Donald Tusk said during a press conference in Sopot, accompanied by Vladimir Putin. We also told each other, with Prime Minister Putin, we had no doubt here that the situation cannot continue, in which in historical matters concerning World War II, but also a dialogue which allows us to leave behind this great trauma, which the tragedy of World War II was. Polish-Russian relations in this context will be worse than Polish-German or Russian-German relations. The documents we have discovered, which we are now publishing for the first time, are an information memo after the visit of Prime Minister Vladimir Putin to Sopot on the 1st of September 2009. These documents clearly indicate that the purpose of building a reset between Poland and Russia was to raise the Polish-Russian relations to the standards of Russia's relations with Germany. It is explicitly stated by the authors of the document in its first point. Prime Minister Tusk emphasized that dialogue and cooperation between Poland and Russia cannot be worse than the cooperation between Poland and Germany and Russia and Germany. Simultaneously, he pointed out that it is inconceivable that it would be easier to build a Polish-German dialogue than a Polish-Russian dialogue in matters of World War II. Sharing the above opinion, Prime Minister Putin expressed his gratitude to Prime Minister Tusk for his personal commitment and commitment of the government he leads in improving Polish-Russian relations. Recognizing that it was possible to work with this government of the Republic of Poland, Putin pointed to the need to strengthen the Christian dimension of the Polish-Russian cooperation. The sentence described in the memo that Vladimir Putin may consider the Donald Tusk government possible to work with was also said at the press conference. It was, however, extended to include the words about how Vladimir Putin assessed cooperation with the previous government, the government of Jarosław Kaczynski. In reality, our relations in the previous period were not so good. I would like to emphasize that we were not the ones to initiate the deterioration of contacts between our two countries. We are very grateful to the active government of Poland for that, in the person of the Prime Minister and his colleagues. We acquired partners with whom we can cooperate.
Z którymi da się współpracować.
According to declassified documents created after Putin's visit to Poland, the issue of blaming Poland for the outbreak of World War II was pivotal from the point of view of Russia's policy. It is demonstrated by the following fragment of the information memo about Prime Minister Putin's visit to Poland and about what happened at a meeting in a close circle between Vladimir Putin and Donald Tusk. We are also presenting this memo for the first time. This document has never been published until now. Prime Minister Putin gave Prime Minister Tusk the book Secrets of Polish Policy, a set of documents 1935 to 1945, issued by the Foreign Intelligence Service of the Russian Federation. He declared that the criticism of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service is justified. He even noted that we found in it matters that require additional clarification and research, because it is impossible to say unequivocally whether certain facts have not been distorted by the authors. If we find that the memo reflects the facts, and so it seems to me that it simply shows the course of these talks, then it provides symbolic testimony to the extraordinary Czechist-like schemes of Russian policy. Putin gives the Polish Prime Minister this scandalous book, prepared by the Russian intelligence service about the secrets of Polish policy, and the declaration that he does not fully agree with it, that he does not share all, that is not all is true, and that there are grounds to discuss it. Imagine this scene when Putin hands this book and says that. The memo does not mention it. The majority of our viewers, and we probably do not remember it at all well. But Tusk, in his own style, just a day or two before Putin's visit to Warsaw, but already at the time when the Russian intelligence service announced that they were publishing this book, organized a historic meeting in the chancellery of the Prime Minister. It was a kind of theatre that, how to say that, in which Tusk is really surprised that his new philosophy of the Polish-Russian relations, and that this constant struggle for warming these relations and such a fantastic visit Putin has been preparing, at least since the beginning of 2009, are accompanied by such dreadful provocations from the Russian side. And he tried, in my opinion, for internal purposes, to flex his muscles, to show that we are not clumsy, and we will simply defend ourselves against this Russian provocation. The memo, significantly, was a diplomatic note of the Polish Foreign Ministry, describing the scene when Putin hands the book, Secrets of Polish Policy 1935 to 1945, is deadly silent, to use Herbert's language, about the Polish Prime Minister using in any way the arguments which he allegedly prepared at meetings with Polish historians.
Którą miał wypracować na naradach z polskimi historykami.
Pani redaktor
This is Maria Stepan, Polish Television. Good morning. A question from all Polish journalists to Prime Minister Putin. Mr. Prime Minister, you spoke today about historical objectivity and not to impose one's own version of history. How then would you comment on the fact that while you were speaking to the Polish Prime Minister in Moscow, the Russian intelligence service organized a conference at which it presented documents allegedly confirming cooperation of the Polish people with the Nazis? Also, in the context of historical objectivity, will the Katyn archives be made available to Poland, and when? Thank you very much. Yes, we spoke today with Mr. Prime Minister. Myself and we in Russia see that there are persistent attempts to pretend that World War II was possibly solely due to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. But if someone wants to find in his old and mould-covered bun some raisins just for themselves and wants to leave all moulds to one of the participants in this process, it will not lead to such good effects, because it does not create the conditions for mutual understanding and trust.
To do niczego dobrego to nie doprowadzi. Dlatego, że nie tworzy to warunków dla wzajemnego zrozumienia i zaufania.
The edition of Gazeta Wyborcza Daily of the 29th to the 30th of August 2009 perfectly reflected this reset atmosphere in Poland just before the arrival of the Russian leader at the 70th anniversary of the World War II in Gdansk. The front page announces Putin's text, which is to appear in the next edition. But at the same time, the front page has a teaser of text published inside the issue. And is it a text by Radosław Sikorski, a lesson on history, modernization and integration.
Modernizacja i integracja.
Russia
has been following the path of modernization and democratization attempts for almost 20 years, which hopefully will make the country an equally reliable partner. Probably never in their history, both in these countries, especially Germany, but also Russia, have followed in such a way democratic values, and their message was not so inspiring.
O relacjach pomiędzy Polską a Rosją pisał profesor Andrzej Nowak.
Professor Andrzej Nowak wrote about this text and the relations between Poland and Russia in his book. Minister Sikorski demonstrated maximum contempt for the traditions of the independent Poland's Second Republic. To move to an even more shocking, the most shocking statement that is, that Russia has never been so democratic, so close to certain ideals of the free world, as just at this very moment, that is in late August and early September 2009. And here we must recall that it was at this moment when the entire Western world was protesting. Sergei Magnitsky, a human rights defender, was in agony in a Moscow prison. Indeed, American, Western European press wrote about how inhumanely someone who simply tries to defend honesty in Russia was treated. It was a time when, after all, the murder of Ania Politkovskaya, committed on President Putin's birthday, was fresh in the memory of the whole civilized world, because it was such a small birthday present in October 2006, and later on Litvinenko, already mentioned here, was also murdered. Let us recall that it was a time at which an organization dealing with journalist safety calculated that it was in 2009 that the number of journalists murdered in Russia exceeded 300. Well, this is some kind of information about the level of security, democracy, liberalism in a given country, if we deal with such numbers. And finally, as our government also knew, because it was officially communicated, naturally to respective military institutions, the Russian army, together with the Belarusian army, was preparing for maneuvers, which were scheduled to start probably 7 days later, on September the 7th or 6th, 2009. The Zapad, or West maneuvers, during which the Russian army practiced a tactical nuclear attack on Warsaw. It was simply one of the objectives of these exercises, and because there was an agreement between NATO and Russia, the Russian side informed about what the drill's subject would be. So, at such a time, a text with such homage like chords, because the text by Minister Sikorski's text had this homage nature, welcoming the Russian Prime Minister on Polish soil, heralding this wonderful time of Poland's concord with democratic, liberal Russia, resonated as a most humiliating scorning of Poland, and perhaps that was the purpose of the Russian side. You welcome us this way, our man, who oversees and organizes all of this. These murders, these very maneuvers, which are to intimidate you, and you say at this point, it has never been better. It is so wonderful that it could not be better. Well, this is the Russian way of humiliating a neighbor. This propaganda aggression by the Prime Minister of the Russian Federation, the intelligence services of this country just before Vladimir Putin's visit to Poland, caused practically just one, actually small protest. Yet the protest, clearly sufficiently cumbersome for the Russian Federation and for those who ruled Poland at the time, for its organisers to be accused by a prosecutor. Accusations as a result of which the Polish Prosecutor General sent documents of the proceedings in this case to Moscow.
Polski prokurator generalny dokumenty postępowania w tej sprawie wysłał do Moskwy.
In recognition of Vladimir Putin's butchery merits, we have so much to pass on to him. Murder, murder. The person responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of civilians in Chechnya. The person responsible for human rights violations, for crushing civic liberties. There is simply no room for him in such celebrations. We are here to remind the public. For me, this protest took place because a murderer was coming, who organised mass killings in Chechnya, and later there was Georgia. And it turned out that he was greeted and talked to normally. I would be ashamed if no one did anything about it. So for me, this protest was a demonstration that, despite it all, someone in Poland can see what is happening. I would like to request that this man to be taken to the police station. They ordered you to arrest me, did they? Did they? Was there a phone call? From whom? Polish or non-Polish services? The Russians demanded to check who did it and why. And our Polish officials decided that we should send them to demonstrate. I don't know. Probably some loyalty. Or they simply received an order and carried it out. And the Russians replied that I did not actually break the Polish law, but I did break the Russian law. But as far as I remember, I believe they threatened me with 120 days of labour camp and a fine of 1,000 rubles. Don't fear Putin. Drink Georgian wines. Poland, Georgia, away with. Goodbye. Vladimir Putin was supposed to address historical policy issues on that same day at Westerplatte, but first meetings and talks of the delegations were to be held in Sopot. Vladimir Putin's visit to Poland here in Sopot, here on the pier, later Westerplatte, on September the 1st, 2009, was a follow-up of the invitation sent by Donald Tusk more than a year earlier, in June 2008. In his letter at the time, Donald Tusk presents a vision of what Poland is capable of doing, what it wants to do, so that these relations unwind in a harmonious atmosphere, and that Russia would appreciate Poland. But another aspect of this meeting is even more important. On September the 1st, 2009, the two interlocutors, both Donald Tusk and Vladimir Putin, already know that even when the newspapers wrote about that at the time, that in a moment the United States would abandon the construction of the missile shield. This is the realization of the goal of Russian foreign policy, which was so difficult to imagine a moment ago, even for the Russians, that, in their conversations with Polish diplomats, they said that they could not imagine it. And yet, it did happen, and at the moment, when they were talking about it on the pier, both Vladimir Putin and Donald Tusk were already aware of it. Since the matters of military security, at least from the Russian point of view, have already been dealt with, they could move on, and certainly they did, to matters of energy security and Russian interests, like gas contracts. Energy issues appeared at the press conference after the Putin-Tusk talks, yet without specifics. These were to materialize only after April the 10th, 2010. For the time being, both politicians made allusions about energy issues. The declassified Foreign Ministry memo from Sopot allows us to better understand where some famous words uttered on September the 1st, 2009 came from. Responding to Vladimir Putin's sarcastic remark concerning LNG purchase in Qatar, we want to throw a spanner in our works. Prime Minister Tusk argued the actions taken in this regard by the Polish government are meant to diversify the sources of energy resources. Donald Tusk uses publicly at a press conference exactly the same sentence that Vladimir Putin used against Donald Tusk, as though he wanted to send a signal to Vladimir Putin that he understood very well what he said a moment earlier, and that he took these words as his own. Please listen. On our part, we take care with the Prime Minister Putin that no one throws a spanner in the works. Putin is clearly mocking the Polish Prime Minister. Later, some sort of a sequel of this verbal ping-pong about energy unwinds. Waldemar Pawlak, Minister of the Economy, takes the floor, or requests to be given it, and desperately defends the Yamal 2 concept on behalf of the Polish government, which was an imaginary concept of Polish politicians led by Tusk, who believed that in 2009 they could convince the Russian Federation, which had been realizing the Nord Stream 2 project for 3 years, to give up the northern gas pipeline and develop the concept of land-based gas transmission with the so-called Yamal 2 through Belarus.
Tak zwanym Jamałem 2 przez Białoruś. Na słowa Waldemara Pawlaka.
Vladimir Putin responds to the words of Waldemar Pawlak, saying more or less the following: do you want to build a branch of a gas pipeline through Belarus? Indeed, at this stage, Belarus seems to be a predictable partner. But why do you want to support Lukashenko's dictatorship? And I cannot guarantee that anything will change there in the future. That is why the Nord Stream is simply a safer system, because it bypasses such an uncertain country as Belarus. One of the first specific effects of Vladimir Putin's to Poland was the signing of this agreement.
Соглашение между правительством Российской Федерации и правительством Республики Польша о судоходстве в Калининградском, Вислинском заливе.
Both the issue of shipping on the Vistula Lagoon and the issue of visa-free travel in this area had been the subject of talks between Poland and Russia since the beginning of the reset. Already in 2007, when Lavrov met Sikorski in Brussels, they discussed these matters. Shipping on the Vistula Lagoon became a fact, or at least an agreement on the subject after Putin's visit to Sopot. The second issue, of visa-free travel, was also realized sometime later to some extent, despite the opposition of Lithuania or Sweden. In the latter case, Russia gained access to the entire Schengen zone, because after crossing the border already inside the European Union, no one controlled them. The agreement on shipping on the Vistula Lagoon proved to be less favourable for Poland than any other previous obligations and agreements after World War II. Since that moment, the Russians formally controlled all of the traffic between the Baltic Sea and the Vistula Lagoon, and no one talked about digging a channel through the Vistula Spit. Both the first and the latter case were at least for some time dealt with by Poland and Russia cared more, both the first and the latter. This encrypted cable signed by Radosław Sikorski after his meeting with Sergei Lavrov in Brussels demonstrates that it was the Russian side that brought these matters to the table. The issue of the agreement on shipping on the Vistula Lagoon best shows the fiction of Polish benefits resulting from the reset. These benefits hardly existed at all. In this particular case, Poland gained nothing, while taking decisions favourable to the Russian side. It was actually similar in the case of the visa-free travel. Nevertheless, Vladimir Putin's visit to Sopot resulted in further acceleration of the foreign policy. Along with this visit, the reset began to take the form of a simply dangerous process. The Foreign Ministry memo, even though it describes in detail the matters discussed at official meetings, is not a complete document. All its first part concerns a meeting in a narrow circle. The meeting was attended by Deputy Minister Andrzej Kremer, who died 6 months later in Smolensk, and Yuri Ushakov, MGIMO graduate, deputy head of the Chancellery of Prime Minister Putin, and later Tomasz Arabski's partner in the talks preparing the Smolensk visit at Moscow restaurants. However, on September 1st, 2009 in Sopot, a one-on-one private meeting of the political leaders took place in the morning. We do not really know what the conversation between Vladimir Putin and Donald Tusk here on the pier looked like, because the testimonies were given in the case are mysterious to say the least. Has the witness discussed primarily with Prime Minister Putin about the possible commemoration of the 70th anniversary of the Katyn massacre on September 1st, 2009? There were actually three public dimensions of the visit. The visit at the time of Prime Minister Putin in Gdansk. The events at Westerplatte, as far as I understand, you are not asking about those, because there were public speeches of the assembled leaders, a formal intergovernmental meeting in a large group, with minutes taken, so you can easily get a very precise reading of these talks.
Spokojnie, bardzo precyzyjny odczyt tych rozmów zdobyć. I trzecie to
And the third meeting, so popular among the media specializing in the Smolensk assassination theory or other such interpretations of the Smolensk catastrophe, the meeting on the pier in Sopot, which took place one-on-one. At the meeting on the pier, as I have said many times in public, a meeting which lasted several minutes, we spoke about such purely courtesy matters. I remember this conversation quite well, because it was very short and carried out interchangeably, a bit in Russian, a bit in English, a bit in German, due to our language capabilities, as it took place without an interpreter and consisted in showing where the beach is, where I go running, where my house is, more or less. Prime Minister Putin talked about such a fragment of his life, that he has a lot of bodyguards even in his apartment, and that he suffered a lot because of this. And that is more or less all concerning the topic of our conversation. I know, Your Honour, that this is not a satisfactory answer for those who believe that it was on the pier that conspirators have set up this secret plan. But I hold no responsibility for this interpretation.
Jeśli jednak przyjrzeć
Yet,
się
if you take a
nagraniom
close look at the
dostępnym w
recordings
sieci
available on the
dla
internet for
porozmawiań
years,
te, które
even though they are
wywołują
not
dłuższe
widely
obecnie
known,
wówczas
such as
na
those
plaży,
shot by tourists
widać,
present on the
że
beach at the
charakter
time,
tych
it becomes
spotkań
clear that the character
trochę
of these
inny niż
meetings
ten, o
was a
którym
bit different
mówił
than that of
Donald
which
Tusk
Donald
przed samym
Tusk spoke about in
pewnością nie
court.
wszystkie rozmowy pomiędzy
Certainly
Władimirem
not
Putinem
all
a
talks
Donaldem
between Vladimir
Tuskiem
Putin and
zostały
Donald Tusk have been
zaprotokołowane.
protocoled.
Choćby to nagranie
Even this recording
świadczy
clearly
jasno
shows
o
that
tym,
Donald Tusk, testifying
Donald
before the
Tusk,
court,
zeznając
did not
przed sądem,
precisely
nie
reflect
do
the
końca
reality we were
precyzyjnie
dealing with at that
oddał
time.
rzeczywistość, z jaką mieliśmy wówczas do czynienia.
Yet, with absolute certainty, it was not the issues of beautiful weather, landscape, or personal security that made Vladimir Putin come to Poland. We learned about the geopolitical meeting of this visit a few hours later, after this meeting had ended. We learned this from the speeches that were delivered in the place where World War II began, at Westerplatte.
W miejscu, gdzie rozpoczęła się II wojna światowa, na Westerplatte.
For every listener, say an official who came to Westerplatte on September the 1st, 2009, for every expert on international politics, it was clear that the entire speech of Vladimir Putin, in its historical and current context, was associated with the entire, one could say, even several years long, foreign policy strategy of the Russian Federation.
Można powiedzieć nawet kilkuletnią strategią polityki zagranicznej Federacji Rosyjskiej. W gruncie rzeczy to wszystko jest, można
As a matter of fact, all this is, one could say, serving the view that Russia is among the most important ones, not in the bipolar system which the Russians fought against, both Putin and Medvedev, but in a multi-vector system. I would say that even in such a pluralistic system of responsibility for global security. In other words, Russia, the United States, Germany, France, it is some sort of Russia's self-invitation to decide together in a concert of powers exactly on what the security architecture of Europe and the world should look like. And of course, it has to take into account the security zones of Russia.
Oczywiście ona musi uwzględnić strefy bezpieczeństwa Rosji.
The speech at Westerplatte was to constitute the political culmination of Vladimir Putin's visit to Poland. The speech was intended to span historical concepts, with future plans to build a great economic space from Vladivostok to Lisbon. Putin spoke as a historian. He associates historical matters set in the context of the anniversary of the outbreak of World War II on September the 1st, 1939, with all of history, one could say, or lecture about the rightness of Stalin's policy, the rightness of Soviet policy, including the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact.
Włącznie z paktem Ribbentrop-Molotov. Ten kontekst historyczny połączył.
He connected this historical context with current politics, referring to or associating with a certain plan which also he himself as a president, and later at that time in 2009, President Medvedev promoted as, one could say, a common goal, not merely European security zone, in which Russia is one of the main architects. Next to the United States and European powers, Germany and France at the forefront. This association of history and current politics is meant to demonstrate that Russia cannot be excluded from the security architecture. The situation in which the former Soviet Union or the Soviets were isolated in the interwar period meant that they had to bear the responsibility for its own security, and thus strategically concluded a treaty with Hitler in August 1939.
I stąd taktycznie zawarła układ z Hitlerem w sierpniu 1939 roku.
В
Without understanding what happened, we will not be able to build a secure world, and we will not succeed in removing the divisions and effects of the Cold War. I want to say that my country recognizes the mistakes of the past and practically builds a new world based on new rules. And it's thanks to the position of my country that the Berlin Wall was removed both virtually and in real life, but also that Europe was allowed to be built without divisions.
Mur berliński wirtualnie i w rzeczywistości. Jak również dopuścić budowę Europy bez podziałów.
The Polish Prime Minister inscribed into this political concept delivering a speech at this place, which in a sense complemented the theses of Vladimir Putin.
Tez Władimira Putina.
Wszyscy bez żadnego wyjątku. Musimy dzisiaj powiedzieć, że je podzielamy.
All of us, without any exception, must say that we share them. These values will protect us from tragedy, that freedom must always be better than slavery, democracy better than dictatorship, love better than hatred, respect better than contempt, and trust better than distrust. And finally, that solidarity is better than selfishness.
I na końcu, że solidarność od egoizmu. Nie znam nikogo.
I know no one who would sit here on these chairs or among you, dear compatriots, who would not share these values. We have founded Europe on them. We may and must fund a security order covering not only a united Europe, but all of our continent with Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. And that meant that listening to these words, Vladimir Putin, a war criminal, a man responsible for the 300,000 victims of the war in Chechnya, his own citizens, and also responsible for the murder of Alexander Litvinenko, Anya Politkovskaya, a man responsible for a recent, merely a year ago, war of aggression against Georgia, was, in the opinion of Donald Tusk, a person who shared the principles of freedom, democracy, truth, respect, trust, and solidarity. In turn, Angela Merkel thus presented her visions of the space between East and West in her speech.
Angela Merkel.
My Niemcy.
We, the Germans, have never forgotten this. Our partners in the East and West have opened the way for us through their readiness for reconciliation. They extend a hand to us, and we received it with gratitude. Yet, it is indeed a miracle that this year we are not only thinking about Europe's history from 70 years ago. It is a miracle that today we may also remember about the happy days of the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the unification of Germany and the whole of Europe.
I zjednoczenia Niemiec oraz całej Europy.
The only speech which questioned this imperial concept here on September the 1st, 2009 was the speech of the Polish president, Lech Kaczynski.
Było przemówienie polskiego prezydenta Lecha Kaczyńskiego.
Powstaje pytanie o rolę naszego kraju.
The question of the role of our country arises. We were not in Munich. But Munich resulted in infringing Czechoslovakia's territorial integrity. An infringement of territorial integrity, which is always evil. It was then and it is today. This is not just a problem of totalitarianism. This is the problem of all imperial or neo-imperial tendencies. We have learned about it last year. Poland joining the partition, territorial limitation of the former Czechoslovakia was not only a mistake, it was a sin. And we can admit to this sin in Poland and not seek excuses. Not seek excuses, even if they could be found.
Nie szukać usprawiedliwień, nawet gdyby się ich szukać dało. Z Monachium
Conclusions need to be drawn from Munich that reach contemporary times. One cannot yield to imperialism. One cannot yield to imperialism or even neo-imperial tendencies.
Ani nawet skłonnością neoimperialnym. Rok po Monachium
A year after Munich, a war broke out. In my country, 5.5 to 5.8 million people, citizens of Polish and Jewish origins, lost their lives. They were there, the victims of this war, like 50 million other people around the world. The Holocaust crimes were committed. However, before the outbreak of the war between the Soviet Union and Germany, there were also other crimes. Katyn requires a moment of reflection. It requires it not because of the facts, which are largely known today, but because of the reasons. Why was such a sentence imposed on tens of thousands of Polish officers of the police, army, and border protection corps? It was an effect of revenge. Yes, it was to be revenge for the year 1920, for the fact that Poland was able to repel aggression at that time. One could say it was communism. No, not in this case, it was not communism, but chauvinism. Also, at this stage, it was an inalienable feature of this system. The Nazi regime was defeated, but Poland did not regain full sovereignty. The Iron Curtain fell over Europe. The fathers of Europe, uniting today, did not limit themselves to the concept of a defense pact. They also built the origins of what is now called the European Union. We have here, among the 27 member states today, and I believe in the future there will be more countries, something that is a completely new quality. This quality should be open to others as well. Yet subject to the one condition of adopting this system of values, that is, a system with no rooms for dreams of what once was, in which one thinks on the basis of equality. This cooperative Europe does not require a scaffolding based on two countries. It requires broad, multilateral cooperation. One could not accept the principle that those who were defeated must also speak of the worst things for them. And those who won do not. There is one truth, in our opinion. In the opinion of Christians, even the worst truth liberates. It does not enslave. It liberates and not humiliates, under the condition that it concerns everyone. We, the Poles, have a right to access to that truth. Access to the truth about matters tragic for our nation. And we may never resign from that. As I said a moment ago, we are able to admit our sins. One also must be capable of admitting sins and not putting the decision on murdering 30,000 people and a typhoid or other disease epidemic on the same level. This is no path to reconciliation. The path to reconciliation, which not only my country needs, but all of Europe does. Thank you very much.
Co prezydent mówił po tym spotkaniu? Co prezydent
What did the
mówił
president
o
say after the
tym, co
meeting?
usłyszeliśmy wówczas
What did the
od Władimira
president say
Putina?
about what we heard then from Vladimir Putin?
Interpretował to, co się wydarzyło.
How did he interpret what happened? As I recall, I was the one speaking more to Leszek. Namely, I told him what face expression Putin had, what face expression Angela Merkel had, and what face expression Donald Tusk had during his speech. These faces were enough for comment.
Kilka tygodni po tym, jak Władimir
A
Putin
few weeks
opuścił
after Vladimir
Polskę,
Putin left Poland,
polscy dyplomaci
Polish
z Ministerstwa
diplomats
Spraw
from the foreign ministry
Zagranicznych
met with
spotykają się z
representatives of
przedstawicielami
Russian
rosyjskiej
diplomacy.
dyplomacji.
Ze swojej strony wyraziłem pogląd,
From
iż
my side,
ewentualne
I expressed the
spotkanie
view that a
premierów
possible
Rzeczypospolitej
meeting of the
Polskiej i
prime
Federacji
ministers of
Rosyjskiej w
Poland,
Katyniu w
the
kwietniu
Russian Federation in Katyn in April or May 2010 could be an opportunity to announce that the Polish-Russian Center for History has initiated its operations. The addressees are as many as 23 people, including a very important associate of President Lech Kaczynski, Minister Władysław Stasziak. There is nothing interesting, significant in this memo. On the same day, September 30th, 2009, another memo is written by Jarosław Bratkiewicz, with a completely different distribution list. Bratkiewicz himself says already in the first sentence that following the first memo, he prepared a second one, in which he included several threads of his conversation with Polanski, which, I quote, require greater discretion. As the Polish press reported, Minister Sikorski expressed his expectation that the prime ministers of the Republic of Poland and the Russian Federation would jointly participate in the celebrations commemorating the 70th anniversary of the Katyn massacre. The interlocutor stressed that the Russian side does not object to such a possibility. At the same time, he was afraid that President Lech Kaczynski may also express his willingness to participate in this joint endeavour, as historical matters are more in the hands of presidents than prime ministers, in the opinion of the Russian side. In my response, I pointed out that historical policy in bilateral dialogue is carried out through the mechanisms of broadly understood foreign service and other governmental links. Still, in September 2009, Polish diplomats heard from Russian diplomats that the latter ones feared such a scenario and that they did not want Lech Kaczynski in Russia. The Polish diplomats concealed this information from the president, while simultaneously utilizing it in their own games and consume it inside the foreign ministry. What later happened between the Russian embassy, the chancellery of the president, and the government went down in history as the separation of visits. Interestingly, in the court trials, lasting many years, the representatives of the Polish state, the Polish government, claimed that the notion of visit separation is merely a journalistic term, and in reality, nothing like that has ever happened. These documents explicitly contradict that. Due to the position you held at that time, did you deal with organising the President's visit on April the 10th, 2010? And, if so, what was your involvement? I did deal with it to a minimum extent, because it was not a diplomatic visit. This subordinate, Mr. Ruczynski, mentioned just a moment ago that the conversation about preparing the departure of the visits to Katyn, such talks concerning the visit of the Prime Minister, or in other words, at the highest level, began already in the autumn of 2009. Do you have any knowledge about this? The talks about this issue indeed began in autumn 2009, but they were not talks about a trip to Katyn, but about a working visit of Prime Minister Donald Tusk in Russia. When did the witness find out about the visits should be separated? One of the Prime Minister? One of the President? Your Honour, I have no knowledge about any separation of visits. the notion of the separation of visits. I believe that the notion separation of visits was a journalistic or political one and rather served to discredit specifically me and my office.
Z tej notatki jednoznacznie wynika, i dlatego ona ma dyskrecjonalny charakter.
It clearly results from this memo, that is why it had a discretionary character. Representatives of the Polish Foreign Ministry discussed with representatives of the Russian Foreign Ministry already in September 2009 about how to organize a visit of Putin and Tusk in Katyn, so that the Polish president would not take part in these Katyn celebrations. And if he wanted to, he would have to organize his own Katyn celebrations.
Wiemy doskonale,
We know perfectly well that this is exactly what it looked like. First, on April the 7th, Putin and Tusk organized the Katyn celebrations in Katyn, and 3 days later, the central state celebrations were independently organized in Katyn by President Lech Kaczynski. Only that while flying to these celebrations, he died together with all the participants of that flight.
Kiedy jesteś blisko wszystkich naszych myśli, staje się realne to, co nam się przyśni, i wszystkie słowa wypowiedziane, bo jesteś naszym wrogiem albo naszym